The gala glittered like a constellation suspended inside glass walls. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, casting fractured diamonds of light across silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase, their music blending with a hum of powerful conversations, mergers, acquisitions, philanthropic pledges disguised as publicity strategies. At the center of it all stood Alexander Vaughn, billionaire investor, media darling, the man whose name alone could move markets. His hand rested lightly at the small of his wife's back, a gesture practiced for cameras. Cameras flashed as he leaned in to whisper something into her ear, drawing polite laughter from the surrounding elite. To outsiders, they were flawless, impeccable, untouchable. But Isabella Vaughn's smile did not reach her eyes. She wore a silver gown that shimmered like liquid moonlight, custom-designed, understated yet commanding. Diamonds lined her collarbone, heirloom pieces from a legacy older than Alexander's fortune. She stood poised, elegant, silent. She had learned the art of silence well. Across the ballroom, Alexander laughed loudly, raising a champagne glass while subtly drifting toward a young venture capitalist. Too close, too familiar. The whispers were quiet but persistent. They had been for months. Isabella noticed everything. The lingering touches, the hushed phone calls, the way he no longer looked at her the way he once had. At precisely 11:47 p.m., she stepped away from the crowd. No dramatic exit. No confrontation. No shattered glass. She placed her champagne flute on a passing tray, adjusted her shawl, and walked calmly toward the private elevator reserved for penthouse guests. The security guard nodded respectfully as she passed. By midnight, her phone was off. By 2 a.m., her location services were disabled. By sunrise, she was gone. No staff had seen her leave the building. No driver had been called. No note had been left behind. And when Alexander Vaughn woke the next morning, head heavy from celebration, ego intact from public admiration, he reached for the empty side of the bed. It was cold. Completely cold. By noon, the markets would begin to shift. By evening, his empire would tremble. And by the next sunrise, Alexander Vaughn would understand that his wife hadn't just disappeared from a gala. She had removed the foundation beneath his entire world. Alexander didn't panic at first. He assumed Isabella had gone to the spa. Or perhaps she'd taken an early flight to one of their properties. Paris, Milan, Zurich. She had always valued space after public events. He convinced himself this was nothing more than that. But by 9:30 a.m., subtle inconveniences began stacking up. His executive assistant called, voice strained. "Sir, the Zurich transfer didn't go through." Alexander frowned. "Retry it." "We did." The authorization was revoked at 7:12 a.m. Revoked? He straightened in his penthouse office, overlooking a skyline that once felt obedient to him. He opened his banking dashboard personally. Access denied. A second system. Restricted. A third. Locked. His jaw tightened. This was impossible. The Vaughn portfolio wasn't just his. Technically, it had been structured under Isabella's family trust decades before their marriage. Her grandfather, a quiet industrial magnate, had believed in strategic positioning. When Alexander married into the family, he gained operational control. But ownership? Ownership had always been layered. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was the CFO. "Alex, I don't know how to say this, but the board just received notice that primary controlling shares have been reallocated under emergency governance protocol." "What?" His voice hardened. "Your wife triggered a succession clause at 6:58 a.m. She's consolidated majority voting power. Legally." Silence filled the office. Alexander felt something unfamiliar, not anger. Instability. "She can't just." "She can," the CFO interrupted carefully. "It was always within her rights. The trust agreement allowed it in the event of reputational risk." Reputational risk. His mind flashed back to the gala. The laughter. The venture capitalist's hand on his arm. The cameras. Isabella hadn't left impulsively. She had executed. By noon, financial media outlets were reporting unexpected internal restructuring within Vaughn Holdings. By 2 p.m., two key investors withdrew support. By 4 p.m., his personal credit line was frozen pending clarification of authority. Alexander stared at the skyline again. It no longer looked obedient. It looked distant. And for the first time in his career, he realized something chilling. He hadn't lost his wife in a dramatic confrontation. He had lost control before he even knew she had begun. By late afternoon, the calls stopped sounding respectful. They sounded cautious. Alexander, we're reviewing exposure. Alex, until governance is clarified, we'll pause joint ventures. Mr. Vaughn, legal recommends temporary distance. Temporary distance. The phrase echoed in his mind like a verdict. He drove to headquarters personally, something he hadn't done in months. Usually, the building seemed to rise in deference when he arrived, glass doors parting, staff straightening, assistants rushing forward. Today felt different. Conversations hushed as he entered. Eyes avoided his. In the boardroom, 12 leather chairs surrounded the polished obsidian table. 11 were occupied. The 12th, Isabella's seat, was empty. But her presence was unmistakable. The lead attorney cleared his throat. Mr. Vaughn. At 6:58 a.m., Mrs. Vaughn enacted Clause 14b of the Sterling Trust. It allows majority shareholder reallocation in cases of executive conduct that may compromise long-term valuation. Alexander's jaw tightened. And who decides that? She does. Silence followed. Documents were slid across the table.
Signed.
Notarized. Timestamped. She had prepared this weeks ago. Maybe months. She has not accused you publicly, the attorney added carefully. This is internal restructuring. Internal, meaning she was protecting the brand, protecting the legacy, protecting the empire. From him. Alexander's chest tightened as the realization settled in. Isabella had never been a decorative wife standing beside him for photographs. She had been the architect beneath the structure. Her family's trust owned 62% of voting shares. Her grandfather's contingency clauses were airtight. Her silence at the gala hadn't been humiliation. It had been confirmation. By the time Alexander left the boardroom, security had been reassigned. His executive access card no longer opened the private elevator. Not revoked, just downgraded. A symbolic gesture. As he stepped into the public elevator, something he hadn't done in years, financial news alerts buzzed across his phone. Vaughn Holdings announces leadership reconfiguration. No scandal. No drama. Just quiet removal. Isabella hadn't destroyed him loudly. She had removed him precisely. And Alexander Vaughn was beginning to understand something terrifying. This wasn't revenge. It was strategy. By evening, Alexander returned to the penthouse. The silence inside felt heavier than the boardroom had. The city lights flickered beyond the glass walls, but the space no longer felt like a throne overlooking an empire. It felt staged. Temporary. Fragile. He walked into the bedroom. Her side of the closet was empty. Not chaotic. Not stripped in anger.
Organized.
Intentional. The jewelry safe, cleared of heirlooms. The document drawer, missing key folders. The framed photograph from their early years gone. She hadn't left in a rush. She had exited in phases. Alexander poured himself a drink, but the burn did nothing. His mind replayed the gala in sharp flashes. Isabella's distant smile, her calm posture, the way she watched him across the room when he leaned too close to the young investor. Had she already filed the paperwork then? Had the lawyers been waiting while he toasted his own ego? His phone vibrated again. A formal email this time. Subject: Transitional Leadership Communication. It was from Isabella. Brief. Clinical. No emotion. In order to preserve the long-term integrity of Vaughn Holdings and protect shareholder interests, I have exercised my rights under the Sterling Trust Governance Clause. This action is not punitive. It is preventative. Preventative. Alexander felt the words settle like ice in his veins. She wasn't accusing him of betrayal publicly. She was protecting the company from reputational risk before it surfaced. Before whispers became headlines. Before scandal touched valuation. He sank into the leather chair in his office. For years, he believed he had elevated her into power. But tonight, the truth crystallized with brutal clarity. She had allowed him to operate within power she already owned. And now, she had reclaimed it. Outside, the city shimmered as always. But for Alexander Vaughn, something irreversible had shifted. By morning, the markets had trembled. By nightfall, his authority had vanished. And Isabella, silent, strategic, unseen, had rewritten the future without raising her voice once. Sleep never came. Alexander remained in his office through the night, staring at the skyline that had once felt like a kingdom under his command. The city lights blurred as exhaustion settled into his bones, but his mind refused to rest. At 5:32 a.m., another notification arrived. Personal accounts, frozen pending structural clarification. Not emptied. Frozen. Controlled. He opened the financial breakdown again, this time slower. Every major holding traced back to the Sterling Trust. Every subsidiary board appointment required majority trust approval. Every expansion he had proudly announced over the years had been legally anchored in her family's framework. He had been the face. She had been the foundation. By 8 a.m., business media channels were dissecting the unexpected but disciplined internal power shift. Analysts praised the move as strategically proactive and impressively insulated from scandal. Scandal. They didn't know specifics. But markets sensed instability before it became public. His phone rang again, this time from a private equity partner he had once considered untouchable. Alex, until governance settles, we'll need to pause the Singapore expansion.
Pause.
Delay.
Review.
Words that once applied to smaller competitors, not to him. He turned on the television. A financial anchor spoke confidently. Isabella Sterling Vaughn, heir to the Sterling Industrial Trust, has assumed consolidated voting authority. Sources described the move as measured and protective. Protective. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Measured. Alexander leaned back, slowly. The gala replayed in his mind again, the way Isabella had stepped away quietly at 11:47 p.m. No confrontation. No spectacle. He had thought her silence meant tolerance. It had meant preparation. And now the realization cut deeper than any public scandal ever could. She hadn't disappeared to escape humiliation. She had disappeared to execute precision. By morning, his empire hadn't collapsed in flames. It had been surgically separated from him. And the markets weren't punishing the company. They were stabilizing around her. Alexander Vaughn finally understood the true loss. He hadn't just lost control of a business. He had lost the illusion that he ever controlled it at all. By midday, Alexander did something he hadn't done in years. He tried to call her. The first attempt went straight to voicemail. The second rang once before disconnecting. The third never connected at all. Isabella Sterling Vaughn had always answered his calls, even during disagreements, even during distance. Silence had never been her weapon.
Until now.
He sat in the penthouse study, sunlight cutting across the marble floor, and opened his email again. No new message from her. Only automated confirmations of restructuring notices, governance updates, and internal compliance acknowledgments. Everything she had done was lawful.
Documented.
Irreversible. His mind drifted back further. Before the gala, before the rumors. He remembered their early years. Isabella wasn't loud, but she had always been observant. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered details others forgot. When he proposed expansion ideas, she asked careful questions about risk insulation and long-term control. He had mistaken her caution for passivity. He now understood it had been discipline. Another alert flashed across the screen. Vaughn Holdings shares stabilize under new leadership. Stabilize. The word mocked him. He checked the internal communications portal, access limited. His executive privileges had been officially reassigned to interim status, pending board review. Pending. A polite word for displacement. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, and finally allowed the truth to settle without resistance. This wasn't an emotional reaction to betrayal. This wasn't jealousy. This wasn't revenge. This was governance. Isabella had protected the trust her grandfather built. She had shielded employees, shareholders, and legacy from reputational risk, including the risk he represented. And she had done it without exposing him publicly, without humiliating him, without drama, which made it worse, because it meant she still valued the institution more than her wounded pride. Alexander stared at the skyline again. He had thought he was indispensable, but the markets had adapted in less than 12 hours. And the woman he had underestimated had just proven something devastating. Power doesn't need to shout. It simply moves and leaves you behind. By the second evening, the invitation stopped. No private dinners. No executive strategy calls. No subtle flattery from rising entrepreneurs seeking favor. Alexander's calendar, once a fortress of back-to-back influence, showed empty white space. He had never realized how much of his power was borrowed. He drove to the Sterling family estate just outside the city, a place older than Von Holdings itself. The iron gates stood tall, immovable, bearing the discreet Sterling crest, not his name. He hadn't visited alone in years. When the gates opened, it wasn't for him. It was for the trust he had married into. The estate manager greeted him politely, but without deference. "Mrs. Vaughn isn't here." Alexander's chest tightened. "Where is she?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that." "Not at liberty." He almost laughed at the irony. Inside the estate library, portraits of Sterling ancestors lined the walls. Industrialists, financiers, strategists who had survived wars, market crashes, and political upheaval. Their wealth wasn't flashy. It was fortified. He remembered something Isabella once told him during their engagement. Legacy isn't built by expansion alone. It's built by insulation. At the time, he had smiled and kissed her forehead, confident he understood ambition better than she did. Now, standing beneath generations of calculated restraint, he felt smaller than he ever had in the boardroom. A legal envelope sat on the antique desk. Not divorce papers. Not yet. It was a formal notice of temporary separation of executive authority pending review of conduct alignment with trust values. Trust values. The language was surgical. No accusation. No scandal. Just distance. And distance in legacy institutions was often permanent. Alexander sat down slowly. He had believed he was the future of Von Holdings. But history, he realized, had always belonged to Isabella. And she wasn't reacting emotionally. She was restoring balance. The gala had been the final confirmation, not the trigger. He finally understood something chilling. She hadn't disappeared out of hurt. She had stepped aside to let consequences fall exactly where they were meant to. The third morning arrived without chaos. No scandal headlines. No public accusations. No dramatic exposés. Instead, financial publications began releasing carefully worded analyses praising Isabella's decisive yet composed governance transition. Commentators described her as the quiet architect behind Sterling-backed growth and a stabilizing force in volatile leadership. Alexander watched the interviews from his penthouse, interviews she had pre-recorded weeks earlier.
Weeks. She had anticipated this.
In the footage, Isabella sat in a minimalist office, dressed in a tailored ivory suit, her posture calm, her tone measured. "Leadership," she said evenly, "requires vigilance. When perception begins to outpace principle, corrective action must be taken, not emotionally, but structurally." Corrective action. She never mentioned his name. She never referenced betrayal. But the message was clear to anyone paying attention. Investors responded immediately. Shares rose 3%. 2 paused partnerships resumed under revised governance terms, excluding his direct involvement. The board released a statement confirming temporary reallocation of executive authority to ensure brand integrity. Temporary. But no timeline was attached. Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from a longtime advisor. "She protected the company from you." It wasn't cruel. It was factual. He walked through the penthouse again, noticing details he had ignored. The art she selected, the architectural plans she revised, the philanthropic foundations under her maiden name that quietly held more liquidity than his personal ventures. He had thought visibility equaled dominance. But invisibility had built insulation. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had avoided for months. Had she known about the affair long before the gala? The answer was obvious. She had watched,
Calculated. Confirmed.
and then acted, not in fury, in preservation. By noon, an official update arrived. He would step down voluntarily pending review. Language crafted to preserve dignity. Language she allowed. Alexander exhaled slowly. She hadn't destroyed him. She had simply removed risk. And in doing so, she revealed something devastatingly clear. He had mistaken proximity to power for ownership of it. By the fourth evening, the penthouse felt less like a residence and more like a showroom waiting for new ownership. Alexander sat alone at the dining table that once hosted ministers, billionaires, and global financiers. The long stretch of marble reflected only one figure now, diminished, silent, replaced. His phone lit up again. Not a business call. A message from Isabella. 3 lines. I did not leave in anger. I left in clarity. You are becoming a liability. He stared at the screen for a long time. Liability. In their world, that word carried more weight than betrayal. It meant risk to legacy, risk to capital, risk to reputation. He typed a response, erased it, typed again, erased again. No combination of apology or explanation seemed proportionate to the scale of what had happened. He finally understood the timeline. The gala hadn't been the beginning of the end. It had been the final audit. She had watched the way he conducted himself publicly. The familiarity, the arrogance, the disregard for optics. In their world, optics weren't vanity. They were currency. The next alert came from the board. Effective immediately, he would transition to non-voting advisory status, pending further evaluation. Non-voting. He no longer influenced direction. He no longer signed off on strategy. He no longer represented the brand at summits. And yet, there was still no scandal attached to his name. No public disgrace. She had preserved his dignity, while stripping his authority. That was the part that unsettled him most. She hadn't wanted to embarrass him. She had wanted to protect the institution from him. Alexander stood and walked toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beneath him. For years, he believed he stood at the top of it. Now, he understood something humbling. He had been standing on a structure reinforced by someone else's foresight. And when that someone stepped away, the illusion of height disappeared. He hadn't lost everything overnight. He had simply discovered it was never fully his to begin with. A week later, the headlines had settled. Markets stabilized. Board confidence restored. Investor calls resumed, without him. Isabella Sterling Vaughan appeared publicly for the first time since the gala at a global investment summit in Geneva. Cameras flashed as she stepped onto the stage, poised, composed, untouchable. She did not wear her wedding ring. She did not explain its absence. She spoke for 42 minutes about governance, legacy preservation, and ethical leadership in volatile markets. Her tone was measured, intelligent, steady. Institutions, she said calmly, are not sustained by charisma. They are sustained by discipline. The audience applauded. Across the ocean, Alexander watched the live stream alone. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was aware. He had mistaken attention for authority, applause for permanence, desire for control. Isabella had mistaken nothing. Back at the penthouse, legal documents awaited him, structured separation of assets not tied to the Sterling Trust.
Clean. Fair.
Controlled. She hadn't ruined him financially. She had simply repositioned him outside the empire. A final message arrived that evening. I protected what I was raised to protect. I hope one day you understand that this was not revenge. It was responsibility. No accusation. No bitterness. Just truth. She hadn't screamed. She had recalibrated. And in doing so, she taught him the most brutal lesson of his life. True power is quiet. It prepares while you celebrate. It calculates while you posture. And when it moves, it does so without leaving fingerprints. She disappeared silently from the gala. By morning, he had lost everything that mattered. Not because she broke it, but because she finally stopped holding it together.